David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So for more than a year now, really since Donald Trump's 2016 election, I've been saying, and others have been saying, that Donald Trump is a symptom of the problem, but Trump is not the problem in and of itself. So as an example, to start thinking about this, Donald Trump didn't create anti-intellectualism and pseudo-intellectualism, but he invigorated it. He benefited from the fact that pseudo and anti-intellectualism has been growing in the United States for decades, and he actually continues to maintain this core and sort of immutable base of support, at least in part because of the anti and pseudo-intellectualism that pervades that base. Another example, Donald Trump didn't create extremism, although he certainly has fomented it, but what he did do was coalesce the extremism, allow the extremists to feel more emboldened and comfortable in the public eye, more so than they have in a very long time. And there's a really nice piece in The Guardian that I read yesterday by British journalist Garret Young, who, by the way, if you've not heard of him, Google or even search on YouTube, Garret Young, Richard Spencer, and you'll see some pretty interesting conversations between Young and white nationalist Richard Spencer. And Garret Young really spells this out in this Guardian piece. And it's a much broader picture even than Young paints. Young says, forget about the rise of Trump for a second. If you are shocked by the global rise of the right, then you weren't paying attention. And he's exactly right. And what this means is that Trump, Brexit, Modi winning re-election in India, the nationalist anti-immigration parties in multiple European countries, this is something that we were seeing the sort of precursors to for quite some time. And Young points out that if you look at the people who were doing the voting in those countries, of course they were eventually going to have an impact. These are Garret Young's words from the article. Quote, "I'd like to focus on one thing that unites them. The countries which keep producing these shocks are every bit as racist, xenophobic, and discriminatory as their voting habits suggest. This is not some new virus. It's a susceptibility to a chronic illness that has crippled us for years. These electoral victories are largely, but not exclusively, the products of those age-old prejudices, not because everyone who voted for them was racist, but because all the racists who did go to the polls voted for them. The intensity of that racism is now growing as the victors use their podiums and dispatch boxes to amplify their bigotry, giving confidence and license for people to spread their poison." This is not shocking. And there's a lot of blame to go around. We're partially to blame for it, okay? Obama was elected, and too many people said we've solved something big. Could have been racism, could have been whatever. But the problems continued, and Obama was very limited in what he was able to do. He was also limited in some senses by what he tried to do. And in the end, there was Republican obstruction. The right wing went crazy, very successfully ginning up all sorts of racial and ethnic animus. And then in comes Donald Trump, and all of these horrible, disgusting enclaves that were invigorated against Barack Obama are now feeling vindicated and empowered and emboldened. And we're seeing the effect of that. We're seeing the effect of that in terms of the victories of these white nationalist and more generally nationalist, xenophobic, anti-immigration parties in Europe. We're seeing it in the emboldening and increase in hate crimes and anti-Semitism and all the rest of it in the United States. And that's one piece of it. The Democratic Party is definitely to blame in the United States. Obama won in 2008. And then the Democratic establishment, or much of it, takes this attitude of, let's compromise on stuff with Republicans because we're bigger than they are and we're better than them. And you know what? We are to a degree, but they weren't going to compromise on a lot of the things that the Democratic Party thought or tried to compromise on. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party, while failing to actually get a bunch of stuff done because of this bogus idea of compromising with Republicans, maintained the pro-corporate status quo in a lot of other areas while having this massive angry movement growing against them under Barack Obama. And then here we are with Donald Trump, not as the problem, but as the sort of, in a sense, logical end result of the circumstances that were fomented in part by the Democratic Party under Barack Obama. And of course, the majority of the blame goes to the extremists. Like, I want to be really clear about that. I don't do this both sides stuff on the show. When there is a both sides thing, I'll still say that even though there is some blame on both sides, here's where the majority of the blame is. You know, we could talk about the left under Obama. We can talk about the Democratic Party. The majority of the blame is the extremists, since they are the ones that we are actually fighting against here. So in any case, we should be disgusted by the rise of the extremist xenophobic right. We should be angry. We should be activated, and we should be doing things to push back. This applies in Europe. This certainly applies in the United States when it comes to the upcoming 2020 election. But being surprised is the last thing we should be. And what's really important, I mean, listen, we got to get Trump out. Okay, there's no question about that. But when we think about the future of Homo sapiens in the modern world, of nation states and governments and all of this other stuff that makes up today's status quo, we shouldn't overstate Trump as being the problem, but rather a sort of predictable and logical end result of decades of anti-intellectualism and ginning up these sort of visceral responses with the Republican conservative red meat. We should think about it as a symptom of the problem that we want to solve rather than the problem itself. Really good piece by Gary Young, which I encourage you to read. There is a completely mind-blowing new claim in a book which says that Robert Mueller felt so strongly that Donald Trump had actually committed criminal obstruction that Mueller drafted indictment documents against Donald Trump. Now, eventually, as we know, Mueller punted on the issue of obstruction and Donald Trump. He said in his report that although there was, quote, substantial evidence of Donald Trump's obstruction, and I believe it was 8 of the possible 14 instances of obstruction, for political reasons, Robert Mueller decided not to decide about indictment on obstruction and sort of punted to Donald Trump's handpicked Attorney General William Barr, who obviously, no surprise, said, yeah, we're not going to indict Donald Trump. But is the claim made in the book true? I don't know. I'm going to lay it all out for you, and maybe we can figure it out. This is from Michael Wolff's latest book. Now, you might remember Michael Wolff wrote his previous book, Fire and Fury, which had all sorts of explosive claims about Donald Trump and his administration and the people around him, some of which have not been proven to be true, or at least have not been independently corroborated outside of the book itself. So we now get to Michael Wolff's new book, which is called Siege, Trump Under Fire. And what Wolff says is that Robert Mueller had actually drawn up a 3-count obstruction of justice indictment against President Donald Trump, but that eventually he didn't file it. And The Guardian asked a spokesman for Robert Mueller about this, and Mueller's spokesman is flat out just saying, didn't happen, and is quoted as saying, the documents that you've described do not exist. Now, that language is relevant, at least possibly, and I'll get back to that in a second. Let's talk about Wolff's sources. Wolff cites internal documents given to him by sources close to the office of the special counsel, okay? Now, what makes this claim not like other random or particularly salacious claims that have been made is that the documents exist. The Guardian has looked at the documents that Michael Wolff has. There is a document which Michael Wolff gave to the Guardian, which says under Title 18, U.S. Code, subsection 1505, that the president, this is a draft indictment, the president is charged with corruptly or by threats of force or threatening communication, influencing, obstructing, or impeding a pending proceeding before a department or agency of the United States. The second count in this draft indictment that Michael Wolff looked at and showed to the Guardian is a count under Section 1512, charging the president with tampering with a witness, victim, or informant. The third count in this document that the Guardian has looked at is under Section 1513, charging Donald Trump with retaliating against a witness, victim, or informant. Wolff says that the documents claim that Trump's obstruction started on day 7 of his administration. And Wolff has endless additional documents, including a bunch of internal memos about whether or not the president can be indicted. And the consensus of those documents is that the answer is yes. So the question is, are the documents real? Is Mueller's spokesperson lying when he denies the existence of the documents? Are the documents fake? If they're fake, who faked them? Is it Wolff? Is it whoever gave them to Wolff? Is it somebody else? There has to be some objective truth here. Either this is real or it is not. And it appears to be binary, except there is a sort of vocabulary semantic possibility here. If you look again at the statement from Robert Mueller's spokesperson, he said, quote, "The documents described do not exist." These are lawyers, okay? Documents described do not exist. That is the present tense. That is very different than saying the documents never existed. The claim from Michael Wolff is that the documents existed, they were drafted, and that they were scrapped. That is one possibility as to how everybody is telling the truth. There well could have been a draft indictment against Donald Trump. It could have been scrapped, and therefore, in a technical sense, Mueller's spokesperson is right. The documents do not exist today, May 29th, 2019. There's another possibility that the documents contained 4 counts against Donald Trump and not 3. Technically, that means that a document containing 3 counts against Trump doesn't exist, but one containing 4 or maybe 2 counts could exist. The Guardian looked at the documents, and they certainly aren't saying that the documents are bogus. And we have the denial from Mueller's spokesperson, which could potentially be a very carefully crafted non-denial. I don't know. Hopefully we'll know the truth about these documents sometime soon. But the end result of all of this is Mueller's got to testify, right? Mueller's silence is a growing problem. It seems he may be sort of willing to testify before the House Judiciary Committee if it's behind closed doors, but will he, won't he? I don't know. The growing questions around this really make it necessary for him to sit down. And most importantly, remember, what portion of the country has read the Mueller report? Is it 1%? Is it 2%? Maybe 5%? Whatever that number is, it's way too low. And Robert Mueller testifying, ideally publicly, would actually serve the purpose of informing people about what's in the report, most of which remains unknown to the majority of the American population. And that's why it's so important that Mueller testify. That's why it's so important that the House formally start a debate about impeachment to get the content of the report out to more than just the, 1, 2, or 5% of the American public that has read it. Let me know what you think about these claims by Michael Wolff, the documents, the Guardian's review of the documents. I don't know what to think, but I do think it's possible that the documents are real and that the denial from Mueller's spokesperson has a very narrow meaning that we should be interpreting. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. I do want to hear from you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, let me say thanks to 2 great new members today. Bridget Sipos or Bridget Sipos, not exactly sure how to pronounce the last name. Bridget, thank you for your support. Also want to say thanks to Jeffrey McCarthy, who is today's second new David Pakman Show member of the day. We are so backed up on new members, which is, by the way, an incredibly great problem to have, that I'm now doing 2 new member thank yous a day instead of 1. And I also want to thank a longtime sustaining member who's been with us almost 5 years, David Hawes. Our 5-year members have been such an important part of the growth that we've had, and it's just incredibly inspiring, this base of support that we've built. Join Bridget, Jeffrey, and David at www.joinpakman.com. The normal prices for membership are extremely reasonable, and I would be thrilled to pay them. But there is also a membership discount code available. This is 2020, all one word, all lowercase. That'll save you 40%. You still get all the benefits. And by the way, yesterday on the bonus show, I told a story involving a situation with a taxi driver in Italy that I had last week, which has thrown the membership audience into a tizzy in such a way that I can't recall happening as a result of a bonus show story since producer Pat kicked a guy in the chest on a Paris subway. So what I would do immediately after signing up is listen to yesterday's bonus show. And actually our voicemail later today has to do with that taxi driver story as well. Okay, let's get to Hatriot Mail for the week. Hatriot Mail is when a professional voiceover artist interprets the hate mail that I get. Here's a little bit more information about Hatriot Mail.
Because thoughts and prayers are bulletproof. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
So this week's Hatriot Mail, it does follow a common theme from the Hatriots, but it's not as common as just general homophobia or anti-Semitism. It has to do with victim complexes and being a triggered snowflake. Take a listen to this.
David Pakman is such a fool, flop, sore loser. The bottom line is this, Packface, no collusion. So now impeach Dave Sociopath Pakman. I tell Vladimir I have more flexibility after the election. Remember that? I condemn all anti-Jewish attacks, but attacks on white Gentiles are the real issue. Jews are gaslighting.
You know, for a political movement that has made a big deal out of not being easily triggered and not constantly needing people to provide safe spaces from them, it's amazing how this movement has grown, which claims that white Gentiles, as the Hatriot says, I guess we mean just people who aren't Jewish, have been sort of really the victims in the United States and in American society for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I don't know how long, maybe dating all the way back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You would think that for people who purport to be these ultimate alphas of all kinds and in all ways, they wouldn't be constantly complaining about how they are actually the victims in the United States of America. In any case, you can take patriotism and make it something good for independent media by signing up for a membership on our website using the coupon code HATRIOT40, HATRIOT 40. You save 40% when you use that coupon code. And the Hatriots hate it because they realize the impotence of their hate. Hatriot40 on any membership at davidpakman.com/membership. It'll save you 40%. This next story almost doesn't even require doing because it's so obvious and it has always been obvious. But Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is now saying that even though he said it would have been wrong to fill a Supreme Court seat during Barack Obama's last year of his second term back in 2016, he actually would fill a hypothetical Supreme Court opening next year, 2020, which, by the way, is the last year of Donald Trump's presidential term. He would not suggest, if there is a vacancy next year, that we wait for the results of the 2020 election so that we can let voters have a say in the direction that they want the Supreme Court to go in. Words almost don't even have the ability to express the brazen and sort of vile political nature of this entire conversation. But I do think we should have the discussion so we can file it and refer back to it when we need to in the future. And I'm sure that we're going to need to refer back to it in the future. So remember that back in 2016, right-wing Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died. This created a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Barack Obama was the president at the time, and Barack Obama nominated Merrick Garland. Now, Merrick Garland was no far-left guy. He was a centrist jurist and completely uncontroversial in relation to the status quo, anyway, in basically every way. The Senate has to confirm Supreme Court nominees. Mitch McConnell was in charge of the Senate in the same way that he's in charge now, and Mitch McConnell blocked it. They never even had confirmation hearings for Merrick Garland. McConnell at the time said, well, you know, it's the last year of Barack Obama's term. We don't know if a Democrat or a Republican is going to win in November of 2016. So it would be appropriate, before we take up any nominations for the Supreme Court, we should let voters have a say about the direction they want the country going, and let the winner of the 2016 election choose Antonin Scalia's replacement. Now, we knew that it was horse manure back then. Presidents are presidents for the full 4 years of their term. The last year is just one of the 4 years of those 4-year terms. And there is plenty of historical precedent for Supreme Court confirmations in the 4th year of a president's term. We knew at the time, if it was a Republican president in 2016, if the nomination had been to replace Antonin Scalia with a right-wing judge selected by a Republican president, Mitch McConnell would have immediately held those confirmation hearings. They would have filled the seat, and that would have been it. Now, at a Kentucky local Chamber of Commerce event, Mitch McConnell was asked, this was yesterday or the day before, someone in the audience said, should a Supreme Court seat become available next year in 2020, what is your position going to be about filling that spot? Meaning 2020 is going to be the last year of Donald Trump's term. You said back in 2016, no Supreme Court confirmations in the last year of a presidential term. What happens if the same situation comes up in 2020? And McConnell simply says, after sipping his iced tea during the event, oh, well, we would just fill it. Check out the video online. I don't want to play it because it's from a local news station. And even though I know that it would be well within our fair use rights to play the video, local news stations are insanely aggressive with their copyright claims. And I just don't want to deal with it because it's bad for the show. But what he said is, oh, we would fill that seat. Now, if you really want to see the deep depths of this sort of post hoc logic that these Republicans are applying, just listen to the explanation that was given by Mitch McConnell's spokesperson for this double standard. Media outlets rightly went to Mitch McConnell's office and they said, hold on a second. Mitch McConnell did one thing during Barack Obama's last year of his term, and he says that he's going to do something totally different, hypothetically, during the last year of Donald Trump's term. How does he explain this obvious political gamesmanship? And David Popp, who is McConnell's spokesperson, said, no, there's a difference between 2016 and 2020. In 2016, Democrats had the White House, but Republicans had the Senate. In 2020, Republicans will have the White House, and Republicans will also have the Senate. That is not an explanation, or in a sense, like it's an explanation, but what he's saying is, oh, the reason that we would do it differently in 2020 than 2016 is because we can. And we control not only the Senate, but also the White House. So it's likely that we would be in favor of whoever Donald Trump would nominate in 2020. But the sickest part of it is that the entire room, or a lot of it, laughed when Mitch McConnell said, oh, we would confirm that person. They're all in on the joke. Like, it's not even something that they're hiding. Everybody knew in 2016 that McConnell's explanation was a dishonest one. And we knew that if the same thing happened under a Republican president, they would just confirm the Supreme Court pick. And lots of Americans, I mean, Republicans too, they all understood that that was the game being played, and they're fine with it. Like it's some kind of funny joke. And meanwhile, remember those people who in the lead up to the 2016 election, people on the left were saying, if it's not whoever I really want, I don't care if it's Hillary or Trump. It's basically the same thing if it's Hillary or Trump. Trump's Supreme Court picks tell us why it's not the same. And we will now have a conservative Supreme Court for a long time, an even longer time if Donald Trump gets reelected in 2020. And this is why Republicans are winning on the issue of the courts. Republicans decades ago decided, they recognized the importance of the courts, and they realized whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's federal judges, whatever, we need to focus on this. And the Republican Party has focused on it, and they're winning hugely on it. And when you have a contingent of the left, which said, Supreme Court, who cares? Hillary, Trump, they're both just too centrist for me. They're both too much to the right for me. I don't care. This is the result, okay? The bed has been made, and now we're sleeping in it. And mostly it's the blame of the right, but there's a little bit of the left that also has to take some of the blame here. And this is exactly the result that we predicted. Let's hope that Donald Trump doesn't get a Supreme Court vacancy to fill next year. And then let's hope that someone else is voted in November of 2020. Make sure you're following the show on Instagram, where we will be polling the audience on an issue related to the Supreme Court. Instagram.com/David Pakman Show. And while you're there, follow me as well. I'm David.Pakman on Instagram.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It is really a pleasure to welcome today to the program T.M. Garret, who's a former white supremacist turned human rights activist. T.M., such a pleasure to have you on. I appreciate your time.
No, thank you for having me.
So, I mean, let's go to the beginning. You started sort of getting pulled into extremist and nationalist groups when you were quite young. I think it was when you were 13. What was initially appealing about those groups?
It wasn't actually the groups first. I grew up in a troubled family, dysfunctional, and I was a bullied kid. There was a lot of things that I didn't understand why other kids wouldn't play with me. And I was craving for a lot of attention, and I didn't get that attention. I always felt like my wishes and my talents that were overlooked. My mom tried hard. She had a drinking problem, but she hid it very well. I never starved. I always had good school supplies, and it was always so important to her that I have good grades in school. So what I really wanted was overlooked. And since I didn't get that attention that I wanted, one time I found the one thing that would give me the attention. It started with racist jokes at the schoolyard when I was about 13, high school age. And, a lot of kids did that, but the other kids went back to normal. The big problem was my normal would have been the bullied kid that you can push around. And for nothing in the world, I would have exchanged it again. So I ran longer with those jokes, those racist, anti-Semitic jokes and everything than the other kids, because I didn't have anything. And I was labeled as a Nazi kid at school. And I didn't like that first, but it had a side effect. I wasn't bullied anymore. And that was the point, why I ran with it. And then it started with hate music. It was the late 80s, 89. And a kid handed me the tape. And first it was not the real hardcore stuff. It was skinhead music, patriotic, and they were singing about how misunderstood they were, and people would call them Nazis, but they were not, and they were afraid of immigration. And I grew up in that little town, 500 citizens. There were no immigrants. There were nothing. It was just 500 conservative people living there, and that's all I knew. And for the first time when I heard that music, I thought somebody is listening to me. Somebody knows me without knowing me. And that was just amazing to me at that point. And with every cassette tape I got, the music got more radical. And that radicalized me too. Until to a point when I went and actively looked for skinhead groups. And I found one and joined that group and went from there.
And when you joined the group, how old are you, first of all?
That was about the age of 15.
Okay. And when you go to that group, are most of the people in the group 15, or are they older, significantly older than you were at the time?
I was pretty much the youngest. They were all about 17, 18, 19. The oldest was about 20. And pretty much all of them at that time, it was a lot more about subculture at that time. Went back to normal, to their normal when they were like 21, 22, 23. It was like the punks. They would get back to normal too. But in that case, there was often that extremist right-wing ideology in the background too. So when they went back to their normal, in their minds, they were still extremists, which I didn't understand back then too. But it was not a gang like you would imagine here in the US. It was overseas in Germany. And all of them either went to school or had jobs, and there was no drug selling or anything. But it was still the music, and there was fights, and we got drunk and everything that was appealing to me. And then the music, and it got more radical. And first it was just about being proud to be a German, and at some point it was about foreigners out and Sieg Heil, and that radicalized me over the years.
And when it comes to the rhetoric becoming real world action, I mean, how much were the people you were around going beyond just the rhetoric and the music and doing things to other people, or like in the real world, as we might say?
Well, it started actually when I joined the first group, because the music promoted that violence against anybody. We got drunk, hammered, and were actively looking for fights. And I was at the time, I was 15, I was more a shy kid. So I didn't get very much along with that. I liked the music, but I didn't like to transfer that in the real world. And every time we got in fights, I tried to be in the background, which didn't earn me the best reputation at the time. But I remember the leader of that skinhead crew. I remember one time, one guy was saying, well, your skinhead career will either end in prison or in a wheelchair. And that was very describing. I remember that very well, because if we didn't find any other gang that we could fight, or if we didn't find one of our enemies we could fight, well, you would just pick somebody amongst your own people just to fight. And that was in the days when I was a skinhead. And at the age of 17, I joined a far-right party in Germany. And that's when the nationalist thought came more into the game.
Can you talk a little bit about how sincere you and the other people in the groups were about the beliefs? And I'll give you a little more context so that I'm clear about the question. When I've spoken to other former KKK people, former white nationalists here in the United States, they would very often say that they were sort of going along for the ride with the beliefs. Like, they didn't really literally believe the anti-Semitic stuff that was circulating. They sort of believed it. It wasn't the most important thing, but the community was the most important thing. And they often talk about sort of this neglected childhood that you also talk about. In your case, how sincere were your extremist beliefs? And do you think the others in the group shared those?
Well, it started with that craving for a belonging, for a family, for a purpose. That is why I joined the first skinhead group.
Yeah.
And I looked for an identity, because I didn't have one. Like other kids, they had an identity as a Boy Scout. They had an identity, I don't know, fans of a certain sports team or whatever. The dads would take them to the games or watch the games on TV. I didn't have a dad. He died when I was young. My mother never remarried. So that was missing. So I looked for that family, of course. And when I radicalized and I joined that far-right party, and later I got more in touch with white supremacists worldwide through the internet. That was in the year 1998, roundabout. And I radicalized more and more, and I was hardcore as it can get. I believed that. I believed that the Jews were taking over the world. I really believed that the race war would start anytime soon. We were waking up already, had nightmares that the police would come, kick in our doors with a search warrant and stuff like that. And the others in the group believed that too. Of course, there were a couple that were more along for the ride. But I became one of the leaders and influencers, and I lived it. I was breathing it. I was waking up with it. I was going to bed with it, and it was exhausting.
Can you talk about what you imagined you would eventually accomplish by your membership in these groups and to this ideology? In other words, the ideology was the basis, but what did you see as the end goal? Was it the extermination of certain peoples? Was it, I mean, what did you think you would be able to do?
Well, that depended on which group I belonged to. When I started being in those skinhead groups, the skinheads always looked at themselves as the stormtroopers. Like in the Third Reich, you had the SS and the party and the leadership, and you had the fighting troops, and that's how we saw ourselves. So we're trying to achieve that, and we're hoping that there would be a Fourth Reich without foreigners, without Jews, hanging the traitors. That's kind of what we believed in. And that got radicalized a little bit more, like the methods, how we want to reach it. First, it was that stormtrooper type thing. Then it was in that far-right party, okay, we can reach it through elections, like actually what Hitler did. He got elected and then took over power and changed the laws. He thought we can do that. And then with the opening of the internet in 1998, and I became more concerned about the white race than just the nation I lived in. I thought we just have to unite it as white people, and especially in Europe. And I don't know how I tried to achieve that at that point. It was a period of 2 years. I really wasn't sure. And then I joined the KKK. And that was a weird thing, because in Germany, the extremist far right is not based on a Christian belief system like it is here in the US, or often, not always. It's more based on the Germanic, Nordic, pagan belief system they have. And then you have the Klan praying to Jesus, who was a Jew. And you can turn it and twist it and whatever. He was a Jew.
Yeah.
And I couldn't wrap my head around that. So I started studying scriptures, trying to find those famous translation errors and everything. And then looking back, we had that idea of the influential KKK that has governors, that has judges, that has police officers, secret knowledge maybe. It's the elite. I didn't think of any trailer park trash or anything at the time. I just looked, what did you read in books maybe, or old movies. And I thought, this is how we could do it. We could infiltrate society and reach our goals that way.
Can you talk a little bit about what started your, I guess we would call it like de-radicalization process? Was it some of these contradictions that you started to identify, or what triggered you starting to question what you were doing?
Well, it happened on my journey through all those groups. I always had questions, and I think every person that is in any kind of extremist group, that doesn't even have to be a white supremacist hate group, it can be any kind of extremist group, has the same questions and the same doubts. You know, if you have doubts, you live in a bubble. You don't talk to anybody outside of that bubble. You take your doubts, put it on a stack, that stack gets bigger, bigger, bigger until it's a mountain. And you know, the people in the bubble, they don't want you to leave. They reassure you everything is all right. They will tell you everything is fine.
Okay, we seem to have lost our connection to T.M. Garret, former white supremacist turned human rights activist. Fascinating conversation for as long as it lasted. I don't know what happened in terms of his connection, but we will... I would like to continue talking with him. Maybe we will have him back on. I guess we will go to a break and then continue with more of the program coming up after this. T.M. Garret, former white supremacist, now a human rights activist, and maybe next time we can learn more about the human rights activist work.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So there's now a growing Republican movement to impeach Donald Trump. It's not huge, but it's there, and it's getting bigger. It's bigger than it ever has been. And one of the people sort of at the front and center of this Republican movement is Republican Congressman Justin Amash, who is saying what are actually pretty obvious and uncontroversial things. Although within the Republican Party, they're certainly rare. Things like, oh, Trump's Attorney General William Barr misrepresented the Mueller report. Shocking. And in a sense, for a Republican to say it, it's progress. And Justin Amash is saying it, and he should be applauded for that. But the most notable thing about all of this is that he's now saying straight up, Donald Trump should be impeached. He had a town hall in Grand Rapids, Michigan yesterday, I believe. And he got a standing ovation, and at least some small part of the Republican Party, at least the people going to his town hall and clapping, is increasingly behind the movement to impeach the president of the United States. Here's just a little bit of video from this event.
I'm confident that if you read Volume 2, you will be appalled at much of the conduct. And I was appalled by it. And that's why I stated what I stated. That's why I came to that conclusion, because I think we can't let conduct like that go unchecked. Congress has a duty to keep the president in check, and it is a difficult process for those who are worried about Congress intruding on the president's powers consistently. It is a difficult process to remove someone from office. It's not easy. So no one's suggesting that just because you start some inquiry or process that a person's removed from office. Nonetheless, we have a job to do. And I think we owe it to the American people to represent them, to ensure that the people we have in office are doing the right thing, are of good character, aren't violating the public trust.
This is a Republican who's saying this. It's just one, but it's something. And of course, Donald Trump immediately over the weekend and continuing to just bash Justin Amash personally with all sorts of insults, tweeting, quote, "Never a fan of Justin Amash, a total lightweight who opposes me and some of our great Republican ideas and policies just for the sake of getting his name out there through controversy." If he actually read the biased Mueller report composed by 18 angry Dems who hated Trump, he would see that it was nevertheless strong on no collusion and ultimately no obstruction. Anyway, how do you obstruct when there is no crime? And in fact, the crimes were committed by the other side. Justin is a loser who sadly plays right into our opponent's hands. So bottom line, okay, one Republican member of Congress says it's time to impeach. It's a big deal in a sense, but it's also not nearly a big enough deal to actually get anything moving. However, will Republican Senator Ben Sasse join? Might, I don't know, Republican Senator Mitt Romney join in? Romney was recently asked about Justin Amash saying it's time to impeach. Romney said it's courageous for him to say it, but that he doesn't actually think impeachment is warranted at this point in time. There's the idea maybe Mitt Romney could be swayed on that. Ben Sasse is a Republican senator from Nebraska who's been a big critic of Donald Trump, and there are rumblings that maybe Sasse would jump on board with calling for impeachment, but it's very, very speculative at this point. So we'll just have to wait and see as far as that goes. Now, as far as Amash is concerned, this guy is no progressive hero, right? It's really important to understand, okay, he sees Trump for what Trump is, but Amash is like an extremist, cartoonish, small government guy. His voting record is atrocious. So this is not praise of Justin Amash beyond just, here's a guy who's a Republican, but he's not getting in line with the partisan position on Trump, period. And that's it, right? Is it likely that Amash is going to be the start of a landslide Republican movement towards impeachment? No, it's not likely. Is it possible Amash is the start of a small subgroup of Republicans who, by joining the remove Trump side, maybe damage Trump for 2020? That's more reasonable. And I think that's what we have to understand. You know, we have to have expectation setting that's reasonable. Are Republicans going to fully jump on board impeaching Trump? No, they're just not. What we can hope for is that the Republican impeach Trump movement grows just enough that it starts to kind of chip away at Trump and become a thorn in his side in his quest for re-election in November of 2020, and maybe does some actual damage. Let's talk about 2020 polling, okay? It's been weeks since I talked about the Democratic primary polling. Partially it's because I was gone all of last week, but partially it's because we've not been following it super closely at this point, but we're now getting close to the start of the Democratic primary debates. Those start next month. And at this point, there are some really clear and defined trends in 2020 Democratic primary polling. And the trends are, for better or worse, Joe Biden is leading, but not by as much as he was at the beginning of May. Bernie and Elizabeth Warren have solidified their second and third place positions. Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg are kind of trading back and forth for the fourth place position. And then there just like are a whole bunch of candidates who can't even break 1% or 2%, who are effectively done and have no chance. So I want to go through this in order and let's see kind of what we're left with at the end. First of all, the green line, if you are watching along with me here, is Joe Biden's polling. And I'll describe it in case you're listening and not watching. Joe Biden's polling hit a high average of more than 40% early in May, and it's now sort of cooled off to just under 35%. So Biden has lost somewhere around 6 or 7 points, depending on the poll you look at over the last 3 to 4 weeks. The question is Biden going to keep trailing off, or will he stick around 35%? The progressive wing of the left is saying the more people know about Joe, the more his support is going to erode because people aren't going to like what Joe Biden is about. That's a possibility. It also could be that there was some initial enthusiasm behind Joe that is just kind of falling off now. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you'll look at the light blue and the brown lines on this image that's on screen. Those are Bernie and Warren. And I'll describe to you what's going on there. Bernie was immediately hurt when Joe Biden entered the race. And you see that when Biden hit his high of around 40+%, Bernie hit his low, but he's since recovered. And Bernie's now pretty solidly in second place, polling an average of just over 16%. Now, Elizabeth Warren, on the other hand, as I told you a couple of weeks ago, has been slowly and steadily growing her support. And it's now at a campaign high. She's moved from being kind of in the 5% area to 7 to 8% in most polls. She's now averaging right about 10%, behind Bernie Sanders, but not drastically so. So let's now look, now that we've seen who the three frontrunners are, let's look at who's done and has no chance. The frontrunners, clearly, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren behind them. And then there's this second sort of mini tier of candidates, which is Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. Harris averaging about 7%, Buttigieg averaging about 6%. Now, the people who have no chance and are getting no traction and will likely start dropping out soon after the debates start are the folks who are under 1% for sure, and a lot of the people under 2% as well. Okay, so under 1% and have no chance whatsoever: Tulsi Gabbard, Bennett, Bullock, whom you may not even have heard of, Hickenlooper, Seth Moulton, Bill de Blasio, John Delaney, Kirsten Gillibrand, Marianne Williamson, Tim Ryan. They're all under 1%. They just have no chance. Okay, I'm not telling them to drop out. I don't really care one way or the other. They're just non-factors. They're done. And I don't even know that there's that much attention to be paid to their prospects. Then you have the 1 to 2% range. Okay, you've got Andrew Yang there. You have Julian Castro. You have Amy Klobuchar, who are between 1 and 2%. They're also realistically done, but if you're at 2%, you can sort of justify staying in a little bit longer. I know that early I said I liked Andrew Yang, and I still like Andrew Yang. I know that 3 months ago he had like a hypothetical path to the nomination if he continued building support. I'm not calling him done now. I mean, he's over 1%, but if he doesn't get to like 3 or 4% after the first debate, I don't know how he justifies staying in. And then caught in this kind of no man's land at more than 2%, but less than anything significant, are Cory Booker at 2.2 and Beto O'Rourke at 3.8. I think they're also both done, but that's enough support to keep raising money, keep raising your public profile by staying in. So that's my assessment right now. If you disagree with me on any of this, let me know, politely, ideally. If there's someone in the under 1% area that you think has a shot, tell me who and tell me why. If there's someone who's polling more than 3% and you do think they should get out right now, tell me who and tell me why. And if you think that there's someone who isn't doing well, but as soon as they get on the debate stage, they are going to be so impressive to the voting public that they will rocket up into at least the 7, 8, or 9% range. Tell me who and tell me why people will be so impressed with their debate skills. We'll follow up. We'll do a poll on the YouTube community tab about this and see where our audience is on a lot of these candidates and issues. Okay, we have a voicemail number. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. Yesterday on the bonus show, I told a story about catching a dog owner letting their dog do their serious business on the front lawn of my condo. It's a small condo, contrary to what the Eggman seems to think in this voicemail that he left, but he is poop shaming he is shaming me for poop shaming a dog owner. Take a listen to this.
Hi, Dave. Welcome back. I think your assessment of Italy versus France was relatively correct.
Thank you.
There's less money in Italy. They're not doing so well right now. It's not like it's a recession. They're just poor. I have family that lives there, and no one that I know anyway is doing great. But Dave, what the heck do you want the guy to do with his dog poop in front of your condo, okay? First of all, you own the inside of your condo, not the outside. It's common to everybody else, right? So I assume this guy did not sneak onto your condo property from somewhere else. So he must live there in your community also.
He doesn't live there.
He picked up the poop and he put it in the garbage. Do you want him to put it in his pocket and carry it around with him? I think this guy was a responsible dog owner. But what this shows about you is that you just have no empathy for people or animals.
Oh, please.
Get a dog, man, and pick up some poop. And then you'll feel, what this guy feels. He did a good job. So don't poop shame him, like you were poop shamed in the restaurant with your stinky shoe. Welcome back, brother Farron and Ben Dixon. Both did really, really good jobs. Shalom. Bye-bye.
Yeah. So, a lot of what the Eggman is saying there is based on things that are not accurate. So the best response, I think, is listen to yesterday's bonus show. There is the poop shaming story. There is the Italian taxi driver story. People abuzz and extremely titillated by the stories I told yesterday on the bonus show. So get access to membership. Become a member, rather, to get access to the bonus show. You will hear all of those stories. Today's bonus show, we'll talk about the Supreme Court decision about Indiana's abortion law. We'll talk about a mass stabbing in Japan. We'll talk about the activist-built U.S.-Mexico border wall, and much, much more. www.joinpacman.com. Coupon code THISIS2020 saves you 40%. But you still get all of the benefits.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.